The morning air hung heavy over St. Mary's churchyard, dense with the scent of damp earth and wilted flowers. Villagers whispered in hushed tones, their umbrellas bobbing over polished shoes as they navigated the narrow paths toward the gravesite. It was a funeral that no one had expected to be tinged with scandal, yet the unease was palpable. Miss Jane Marple, small and unassuming in her faded grey coat and sensible hat, had come not merely to pay respects but to satisfy a curiosity that had gnawed at her since she heard the news. The deceased, Mr. Edward Langley, had been found dead in his study only a week prior, and even now the circumstances were so baffling that the local constable, Chief Inspector Simmons, had thrown up his hands in quiet frustration. The house itself was a quaint Victorian affair, tucked between ancient oaks that cast long shadows across the garden path. It had been locked from the inside when Langley was discovered, and the single window, slightly ajar, had shown no signs of tampering. The coroner declared it a natural death at first glance, but something about the scene refused to sit comfortably with the sharp mind of those who had investigated. On his desk lay a single sheet of paper, curious in its simplicity, a note scribbled in an almost childlike hand, reading only, "Look beyond the numbers." No signature, no date, nothing that might hint at the author or their intentions. It was the sort of clue that suggested either an elaborate trick or an earnest plea for attention, and either way it had left the investigators floundering. Miss Marple had observed these things quietly, listening to the villagers' hushed speculation. Langley, she had heard, was a man of meticulous habits, almost to the point of obsession. His accountant had remarked on his peculiar fondness for ledgers, while the housekeeper hinted at an almost ritualistic nightly routine involving the careful arrangement of letters and bills. Yet none of these small oddities explained how a man who lived alone, with no known enemies, had come to his untimely death under such mysterious circumstances. The coroner, though professional and thorough, could not deny that something about the scene seemed deliberately staged to perplex anyone who sought a simple explanation. The funeral proceeded with its sombre rituals, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, tracing through the strands of evidence like threads on an old quilt. She noted the peculiar reactions of those present. Mrs. Langley, the widow, exhibited a serenity that bordered on studied detachment. Mr. Charles Whitby, a distant cousin, appeared almost overly attentive to the arrangement of flowers, and the family solicitor seemed nervous, shifting from foot to foot as he read the eulogy. Each of these small, almost imperceptible behaviours seemed like pieces of a puzzle that refused to settle neatly into place. After the burial, as the crowd dispersed under a reluctant drizzle, Miss Marple lingered near the gravestone, her keen eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. She had a reputation for noticing what others overlooked, the minute inconsistencies that might betray a hidden motive. Today, her attention was drawn not to the grand gestures of grief, but to a subtle disturbance in the soil, a small indentation that suggested something had been shifted or hidden recently. It was easy to dismiss as the careless step of a mourner, yet she felt a twinge of certainty. Langley's death was no ordinary misfortune. The clue left on his desk was a signal, however cryptic, and someone had used it to their advantage. Miss Marple recalled the brief conversation she had overheard between Chief Inspector Simmons and his assistant the night before the funeral. They were frustrated by the absence of any obvious entry or exit points, and the note had left them equally confounded. "It's almost as if he wanted to be found this way," Simmons had muttered, staring at the desk. But why leave a riddle? The thought had lingered with her because riddles, she knew, were never random. They were deliberate, meant to mislead or to guide, and sometimes both. The seemingly innocuous instruction to look beyond the numbers gnawed at her mind. Langley had been a meticulous man. Numbers were his language. If there was a hidden truth in those ledgers, it might reveal far more than a simple accounting error. It might expose a secret that someone had gone to great lengths to protect. The air grew colder as the procession emptied, leaving only the muted sounds of the village and the occasional rustle of leaves. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves and looked back toward Langley's house, its dark windows staring like the eyes of a sentinel. Somewhere within those walls lay the answer, hidden behind the ordinary, masked by the ordinary, waiting for a patient mind to unravel it. The unsolvable crime, it seemed, was nothing of the sort for those who knew how to see the patterns beneath the surface. And Miss Marple, with her unassuming demeanour and a mind sharpened by years of observing human nature, was already beginning to see the threads that others had overlooked. The truth, she suspected, would reveal itself, but only to those willing to look beyond the numbers. Miss Marple's first opportunity to examine the house came a day after the funeral, when Chief Inspector Simmons, reluctantly persuaded by the widow's polite insistence, allowed her to revisit the scene. The front door, still slightly polished from the day of the funeral, opened with the familiar creak, revealing the dim hallway that led to Edward Langley's study. Everything. NG had been left untouched since the initial investigation. Polished furniture, carefully arranged books, and that single sheet of paper on the desk. To anyone else, the room appeared pristine, orderly even, yet to Miss Marple, each item seemed to whisper secrets. She began slowly, almost hesitantly, letting her gaze drift over the room. Her attention first fell on the desk itself, a mahogany piece of heavy craftsmanship, and the note that had so baffled the constables. Leaning slightly closer, she observed the faint indentation beneath the words, the kind left when a pencil presses with unusual force. Someone had been deliberate, almost obsessively so, in the way the note was written. The handwriting was simple, yet deliberate, and it carried the peculiar rhythm of someone used to recording figures and ledgers, perhaps Langley himself or someone who knew him well. Moving further into the room, her eyes settled on the shelves lining the walls. Rows of meticulously labelled binders caught her attention, each one arranged by month and year, but one binder, small, unassuming, dark green, was slightly out of place. Its spine jutted forward just enough to suggest that someone had handled it recently. Miss Marple reached for it with delicate fingers, noting the faint fingerprints along its edge. Unlike the other binders, this one lacked the neat calligraphy on its label. Instead, a single word was scribbled: accounts. Odd, she thought, that Langley, so precise in life, would allow such an irregularity. Her musings were interrupted by the soft shuffle of feet behind her. Mrs. Langley had entered, her expression calm yet oddly measured, as if she were rehearsing a role she had played many times before. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice light but with an undercurrent of caution, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Miss Marple inclined her head, keeping her focus partly on the widow, and partly on the green binder. Something about Mrs. Langley's posture, the careful control of her hands, the almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders, suggested a mind alert to scrutiny. "Yes, I only wish to observe a few details," Miss Marple replied softly. "It is remarkable how often the smallest items reveal the largest truths." Mrs. Langley's eyes flickered briefly toward the desk, where the note remained, and a subtle shift in her expression caught Miss Marple's attention, a shadow of unease gone as quickly as it appeared. A fleeting reaction, almost imperceptible, yet in Miss Marple's experience, such reactions were rarely accidental. Her gaze then fell upon a peculiar object on the floor near the window, a small brass key, half hidden beneath the edge of a Persian rug. The police had overlooked it, likely dismissing it as part of the household trappings, yet its placement seemed deliberate. Miss Marple bent to examine it more closely, noting the fine scratches along its edges, signs of frequent use. It was unlikely to belong to any ordinary lock in the house. Whoever had dropped it or left it had done so with the expectation that it might go unnoticed. Miss Marple's mind began to trace the possible connections: the misplaced binder, the cryptic note, the carefully concealed key, and the widow's subtle signs of tension. Something, or someone, had manipulated these elements with care, creating a scene that appeared orderly yet concealed layers of intention. She recalled a phrase she had often heard among the village folk: "Order is the mask of chaos." Here it seemed chaos had been masked so well that the casual observer would never suspect its presence. As she straightened, Miss Marple's eyes fell on the family solicitor, who had accompanied Mrs. Langley into the room. He lingered near the doorway, ostensibly examining a ledger, yet his glances darted repeatedly toward the desk. Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his fingers and the faint twitch of his jaw. Tiny betrayals of anxiety. He might have been a man accustomed to handling sensitive matters, but even practiced composure could not entirely disguise the pangs of worry when confronted with unforeseen scrutiny. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. The threads of deception were beginning to show, not in grand gestures or overt confessions, but in the minutiae. The subtle shifts, the minor inconsistencies, the overlooked object on the floor. While Chief Inspector Simmons had followed routine procedures, cataloguing evidence and taking statements with procedural rigor, it was the nuances that spoke most clearly. Already, Miss Marple sensed the outline of a carefully constructed ruse, one that required patience, observation, and a mind trained to read between the lines. The pieces were there. It was only a matter of time before they began to form the picture that the police had yet to glimpse. And in that quiet study, with sunlight filtering softly through lace curtains, Miss Marple understood that the unsolvable crime was only waiting for someone willing to notice, the invisible, someone willing to see what everyone else ignored. The key, the binder, the note, and the subtle tremor of a hand all hinted at a hidden story. She would need to unravel it, delicately, methodically, as one might trace a pattern woven invisibly into a tapestry, until the truth revealed itself fully, layer by layer. The following morning, Miss Marple found herself seated in the solicitor's office, a room lined with legal tomes and the faint scent of aged paper. Chief Inspector Simmons had agreed, if somewhat reluctantly, to allow her to observe the questioning of key witnesses, convinced that her unconventional methods might illuminate details his routine investigations had missed. The first to arrive was Mr. Charles Whitby, the distant cousin whose attentiveness at the funeral had already caught Miss Marple's notice. Whitby presented himself with a polished air, bowing slightly before taking the offered chair. He spoke smoothly, recounting the events of the week leading up to Langley's death. Yet Miss Marple noticed that his recollections were almost too precise, the timings and actions laid out with an almost unnatural symmetry. When questioned about the afternoon of the day Langley died, he claimed to have been in the library tidying ledgers, yet his eyes flickered toward the widow, as if seeking approval for his account. Next came Mrs. Langley herself. She carried an air of calm composure, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her voice was soft but steady as she recounted Langley's last days, describing his meticulous routines and his habit of reviewing ledgers late into the night. Yet she offered little in the way of concrete details about the note or the key Miss Marple had observed in the study. Whenever the subject turned to the note, she paused slightly, a pause that, to Miss Marple, hinted at the careful weighing of her words. "Edward was always cryptic," she said finally, "and I fear I may never truly understand his little puzzles." There was a deliberate vagueness to her phrasing, a subtle deflection that suggested she was aware of more than she let on. The family solicitor, Mr. Harding, was last. He was a man accustomed to the subtle interplay of disclosure and concealment. He spoke freely of his professional dealings with Langley, recounting minor transactions, contracts, and the careful handling of the estate. Yet Miss Marple detected a careful shaping of his story, certain phrasing that seemed rehearsed, each word chosen to convey helpfulness while avoiding unnecessary revelation. When asked directly about the note, his hands twitched, slightly over his briefcase, and he stammered, I haven't seen anything unusual, just the usual records, you know." That faint hesitation, the nervous tick, was the kind of detail Miss Marple had learned to observe carefully. As the questioning continued, contradictions began to emerge. Whitby insisted he had seen the window close before leaving the study, yet Mrs. Langley implied it had been slightly open when she passed by. Harding recalled Langley's desk as neat and untouched, but Miss Marple knew from her earlier visit that the green binder had been out of place. Were small discrepancies, easily dismissed by those untrained to detect the underlying pattern, but to Miss Marple they suggested hidden manoeuvring, someone attempting to construct a story that would satisfy casual scrutiny while obscuring the truth. She also noticed the subtle interplay between the witnesses themselves. Whitby's glances toward the widow were almost imperceptible, yet Miss Marple could sense a silent communication, a checking of reactions to ensure his statements aligned with the version deemed acceptable. Mrs. Langley, for her part, seemed to measure her words carefully, yet the flicker of expression when certain details were mentioned betrayed a mind attuned to controlling the narrative. Even Harding, whose calm professionalism might have suggested detachment, revealed through tiny gestures, a tight grip on the armrest, a throat cleared too frequently, that he too was invested in the outcome. Miss Marple listened patiently, letting the contradictions settle in her mind like sediment in a jar. Each slight deviation, each hesitation, each carefully controlled facial expression provided insight far more valuable than the polished accounts themselves. The note, the green binder, the misplaced key, all were still present in her thoughts, silent witnesses to a story that the Whittons were trying, consciously or not, to rewrite. She began to sense the threads of deception intertwining with ordinary grief and human concern, forming a complex tapestry that would require patience and careful scrutiny to unravel. By the time the questioning concluded, it was clear that no single statement could be taken at face value. The motives lay hidden beneath layers of social propriety, financial interest, and personal pride. Miss Marple reflected quietly as she watched the trio depart, each carrying their carefully constructed versions of reality. To the untrained eye, the mystery might have seemed impenetrable, but Miss Marple's keen perception, honed through years of observing subtle human behavior, allowed her to detect the pulse of deception that others overlooked. She understood that while the surface told one story, the truth, as always, was concealed beneath, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And in that moment, she suspected, it would be far more illuminating and far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon walking the village streets, her mind quietly untangling the threads she had observed at the solicitor's office. Each witness, each minor contradiction, suggested a motive, but motives alone, she knew, were never enough. They were shadows cast by human desire, often misleading and incomplete. Edward Langley's death had stirred more than grief. It had awakened the intricate web of relationships and rivalries that lay beneath the seemingly placid surface of the Langley household. She began with Whitby, the distant cousin whose presence at the funeral had seemed almost excessive in its attentiveness. Whitby had inherited nothing directly from Edward, yet his sharp interest in the ledgers and accounts hinted at a financial curiosity that went beyond mere familial concern. Miss Marple recalled snip. Tease of conversation. Whitby had, on more than one occasion, mentioned the possibility of expanding the family business and had asked unusually pointed questions about Edward's recent investments. The motive of greed, while not overt, seemed plausible, especially for a man whose ambition sometimes outweighed his scruples. Yet greed alone did not account for the precise manner of Edward's death, the careful placement of the note, or the deliberate appearance of the key. Mrs. Langley, on the other hand, presented a more enigmatic possibility. Her serene composure and careful speech concealed more than it revealed. Miss Marple considered the widow's recent behaviour, the subtle tension, the pauses in her narrative, the way she had, almost unconsciously, observed the reactions of others in the room. Could fear have been a motive? Perhaps Edward had discovered something in the past weeks that threatened her position or reputation. Or perhaps her calm was a shield, hiding resentment or grief twisted into something darker. Yet, if she were the orchestrator, why leave a note that seemed to invite discovery? Miss Marple mused on the psychology of concealment and exposure. Sometimes a carefully crafted breadcrumb could mislead as effectively as it revealed. Then there was Harding, the solicitor, whose professionalism masked a hidden investment in the estate's outcome. Miss Marple reflected on the slight tremors, the careful selection of words, and the fleeting gestures that betrayed him during questioning. While he had much to gain from mismanaging the estate, or ensuring that certain documents remained undiscovered, he seemed cautious, almost hesitant to take an overtly aggressive stance. Perhaps he acted out of loyalty, perhaps out of self-interest. Both motives could coexist, forming a tangled, almost imperceptible layer of intent. As the day wore on, Miss Marple began mapping the connections in her mind, tracing the intersections of desire, opportunity, and fear. Each suspect's potential motive intersected with the others in unexpected ways. Whitby's greed might be tempered by fear of discovery. Mrs. Langley's fear could mask resentment. Harding's loyalty might be complicated by a quiet ambition. The crime, she realized, had been crafted with this very complexity in mind. A stage set for multiple players, each with reason to manipulate appearances and obscure the truth. The green binder, the brass key, and the note all began to take on new significance. The binder suggested a hidden record, something worth examining that might expose financial irregularities or private dealings. The key implied restricted access, a secret space perhaps, that only certain individuals could reach. The note, with its enigmatic instruction to look beyond the numbers, now seemed less a clue and more a challenge, left deliberately to mislead or test the intelligence of whoever found it. Miss Marple could almost see the sequence of events in her mind, each carefully orchestrated to misdirect the untrained eye while concealing the motive behind a mask of routine and propriety. She revisited the inconsistencies in alibis, Whitby's polished account of library work, Mrs. Langley's vague recollections of Edward's evening routines, Harding's rehearsed statements regarding the ledgers, none of them fully aligned with the evidence she had observed: the misplaced binder, the key's strange placement, the subtle disturbances in the study. Here, in the gaps between statements and objects, lay the hidden pattern. The motive maze was vast and intricate, yet the intersections offered guidance. Miss Marple understood that unravelling the truth required patience, a careful reading of human behaviour, and an acute attention to detail. By evening the village was quiet, and Miss Marple returned to her small lodgings, a notebook filled with observations clasped to her chest. The tangled motives of greed, fear, jealousy, and ambition had begun to coalesce into a rough map of possibility. Each suspect was implicated in some way, yet no single theory explained everything. She sipped her tea slowly, considering the next step, revisiting the house to examine the binder, questioning the servants whose silent observations often held truths more telling than polished statements, and tracing the subtle links that might reveal the mind behind the seemingly unsolvable crime. The web was intricate, the threads delicate, but Miss Marple felt the faint stirrings of clarity, a sense that the truth, while hidden, was within reach, and that the key to unlocking it lay in understanding not just the evidence but the human heart behind the deception. The following morning, news of a supposed breakthrough reached Miss Marple even before she had arrived at the Langley house. Chief Inspector Simmons had called a hurried meeting, announcing that the green binder, finally examined in detail, contained a series of financial irregularities implicating Charles Whitby. The ledgers showed unusual transfers, a network of accounts that at first glance seemed to suggest embezzlement and a motive for silencing Edward Langley before he could uncover the full extent of the discrepancies. Whitby himself had been called in, and the inspector reported that he appeared flustered, unable to fully explain the inconsistencies. It was, on the surface, the perfect resolution: a clear motive, a suspicious hand in the accounts, and the brass key, now presumed to open a locked filing cabinet that held the missing documents. The village buzzed with quiet satisfaction. Whitby's reputation, carefully cultivated and previously untouchable, now lay in tatters. The authorities were ready to close the case, eager to declare the mystery solved and reassure the anxious townsfolk. Whitby, for his part, maintained a strained composure, insisting that he had only been managing the finances as Edward had requested. Yet his voice lacked conviction, and the evidence against him appeared, at least superficially, compelling. Miss Marple, however, felt no such relief. She had spent the night reviewing her mental notes, considering the subtle details that others seemed content to overlook. The binder, she realized, told only part of the story. Its contents could be incriminating, yes, but financial irregularities were not proof of murder, nor did they explain the cryptic note, the carefully positioned key, or the minute disturbances in the study she had observed weeks before. Something about the simplicity of this solution felt too neat, too tidy, as though it had been arranged to mislead rather than illuminate. She returned to the Langley house under the pretense of checking on the scene herself, ostensibly, to ensure no evidence had been disturbed. Whitby's demeanour remained tense but outwardly cooperative, yet Miss Marple's keen eye caught what the inspector had missed: the faintest trace of mud on the rug near the window, slightly darker than the rest of the mat, and a tiny smudge of ink on the edge of the desk that did not correspond with the handwriting in the binder. These were insignificant, perhaps, to the untrained observer, but to her they whispered a different narrative. Someone had planted the financial irregularities as a convenient trap, designed to draw suspicion to Whitby while diverting attention from the true orchestrator. As she observed the room, her thoughts returned to Mrs. Langley. The widow's calm had not wavered during the official breakthrough, yet Miss Marple remembered the brief flicker of unease when Whitby's name had been mentioned earlier. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it suggested foreknowledge, a controlled reaction that masked awareness of the deeper game at play. Harding, too, remained unusually composed, offering guidance to Whitby about the handling of the ledgers and the apparent errors. But he had looked briefly toward Mrs. Langley at one point, a silent exchange that spoke volumes to anyone attuned to such subtleties. The inspector, confident in his early success, pressed Whitby for a confession, citing the incriminating ledgers and the mysterious note. Whitby's protests were loud, yet he seemed cornered, his words stumbling in the face of what appeared, externally, to be overwhelming evidence. Villagers standing in the hall whispered among themselves, some relieved, some shocked that the case could be resolved so quickly. And yet Miss Marple felt a quiet, gnawing unease, a sense that the final piece of the puzzle had yet to fall into place. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the household settled into a strained routine, Miss Marple lingered in the study. She examined the binder again, her fingers tracing the edges, her mind tracing the connections between note, key, and ledger. The neat narrative that Chief Inspector Simmons had accepted seemed insufficient, a superficial solution covering a far more intricate truth. Somewhere, in the shadows of this careful construction, the real criminal remained, watching the village acceptance of Whitby's guilt, waiting for the moment when the charade would allow a final move to conceal the ultimate truth. Miss Marple's small, serene face reflected neither triumph nor frustration, but the quiet intensity of someone who understood that apparent victories could be deceptive. She had learned long ago that the most dangerous criminals were those who thrived in plain sight, manipulating perceptions while hiding their actions behind ordinary facades. His case, she realized with a subtle tightening of her fingers around the edge of the desk, was far from over. The threads were beginning to reveal themselves, but the tapestry of deceit had many more layers yet to be uncovered, and the final truth would not emerge until she had carefully traced each one, without allowing herself to be misled by the easy answers the world so eagerly accepted. Late that evening, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire in her lodgings, the soft glow illuminating a stack of notes and observations she had compiled since her first visit to the Langley house. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, letting the events of the past days settle in her mind. The more she reviewed the evidence, the note, the binder, the key, the more a familiar pattern began to emerge, one she had seen before in seemingly ordinary households, where old grievances and hidden histories shaped the present. Sometimes, the roots of a crime ran deeper than the immediate motives of greed, fear, or ambition. Sometimes, they stretched back years, quietly entangling those involved long before anyone suspected. It was the green binder, inconspicuous as it was, that had started her thinking along these lines. The irregular entries, the small discrepancies in accounts, and the unusually specific dates suggested more than recent financial maneuvering. They hinted at long-term planning, a sequence of events laid down with meticulous care over time. Miss Marple's mind wandered to the brief village rumour she had overheard months ago about a disagreement between Whitby and Edward over a business venture that had ended acrimoniously. A minor dispute, everyone had said at the time, yet in Miss Marple's experience even the smallest rift could fester quietly, especially when pride and resentment were involved. Her thoughts then turned to Mrs. Langley, and a subtle memory resurfaced, a conversation with an elderly neighbour who had once mentioned a family scandal from decades earlier. The widow, it seemed, had ties to a distant branch of the Langley family, connections that had been conveniently obscured in public records. There had been whispers of a dispute over property, a disagreement that had left lingering bitterness, and an incident long forgotten by the casual observer, but remembered by those involved. Miss Marple realized that the widow's calm composure might be the product of decades of carefully maintaining appearances while quietly safeguarding secrets. Secrets that had now intersected with Whitby's ambitions and the meticulous habits of Edward Langley himself. Miss Marple also recalled a seemingly insignificant case she had encountered years before in a neighbouring village, involving subtle financial misdirection and a forgery of documents designed to obscure ownership. At the time, the circumstances had seemed unconnected, a minor curiosity in her collection of observations. But now pieces fell into place. The style of handwriting in the ledger, the carefully crafted entries in the binder, and the calculated placement of the key all suggested the same sort of long-planned deception. Someone had orchestrated the circumstances to appear natural, to mislead any casual investigator, while covering a secret rooted in a past grievance. With this in mind, she began to examine the relationships among the three key figures more closely. Whitby's greed and ambition now appeared entwined with historical disputes. His dealings were not merely opportunistic, but had been influenced by old resentments and half-remembered family grievances. Mrs. Langley's poised reactions were no longer simply defensive. They were protective of a history, carefully hidden from public view. Even Harding, the solicitor, had a connection to the past that was subtle but significant, a Millie Trust he had administered for years, bridging the affairs of both Whitley and Langley, and placing him at the nexus of opportunity and knowledge. It was the convergence of these past and present factors that explained the otherwise perplexing inconsistencies. The note's cryptic wording, the binder's seemingly innocent irregularities, and the key's deliberate placement were not random. They were echoes of prior events, carefully laid reminders or warnings for those in the know. Miss Marple felt a thrill of understanding. The crime was not a spontaneous act, but a culmination of decades-long entanglements, a story written over time in shadows and half-remembered slights. The room seemed to grow quieter around her as she pieced together the emerging narrative. Every glance, every hesitation, every subtle misstep she had observed in the questioning of witnesses now carried a new significance, refracted through the lens of history. The present crime was inseparable from its past. Only by untangling these hidden connections could the true perpetrator be revealed. Miss Marple's mind traced each link, carefully noting where ambition, resentment, and secrecy intersected. She understood, with the steady certainty that came from years of observation, that the final revelation would hinge not on a single piece of evidence, but on the intricate web of relationships and grievances that had lain dormant for years, only now surfacing in the quiet tragedy of Edward Langley's death. And in that moment she knew the next step, to confront the past as it lingered in the present, to follow the threads of old disputes and forgotten alliances, and to uncover the truth that had remained hidden beneath layers of civility and propriety, waiting for the patient eye that could see beyond appearances. The next morning Miss Marple returned to the Langley house, armed not with formal authority, but with the quiet confidence born of years spent reading human nature in all its guises. She had decided to employ a tactic she often found surprisingly effective, subtle suggestion combined with carefully staged observation. Rather than interrogate, she would arrange circumstances that prompted the suspects to reveal themselves, sometimes involuntarily, through gesture, speech, or hesitation. It was a method that required patience and discretion, but one she trusted more than hurried accusations or heavy-handed questioning. She arrived as Whitby was reviewing the ledgers again, ostensibly to reconcile the discrepancies highlighted the day before. Miss Marple offered a polite greeting and seated herself near the desk, letting her gaze wander casually over the room as if merely indulging idle curiosity. Then she spoke, soft but deliberate. "I can't help but wonder, Mr. Whitby, why Mr. Langley kept certain accounts so meticulously separate from the rest. It seems almost as though he wished to conceal something from even the closest of us." Her voice carried no accusation, only a musing that invited reaction. Whitby's hand froze mid-pencil stroke, and for a fraction of a second his composure cracked. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darting toward the green binder as if seeking reassurance. I don't know," he stammered, lowering his pencil. "Edward. He always had peculiar ways of organizing his finances. I didn't question them. Yet the slight tremor in his hand betrayed unease that contradicted his words." Miss Marple smiled gently, letting the silence linger. "Perhaps it was not the accounts themselves," she continued, "but the knowledge of their contents. A secret kept too carefully often attracts more attention than one left in plain sight." Her words were ordinary, unthreatening, yet their implication pressed upon Whitby in a way she knew would provoke thought. His eyes flickered briefly toward Mrs. Langley, who had entered quietly during the exchange and stood observing with her customary calm. The widow's expression did not change outwardly, but Miss Marple noted the smallest details. A slight clenching of the fingers on her handbag, a subtle tightening around the mouth, a fleeting glance toward Harding, who was reviewing some correspondence at a nearby table. These were almost imperceptible reactions, yet they were meaningful to a trained observer. The suggestion of secrets, of past knowledge, had elicited a crack in the otherwise perfect facade. Miss Marple allowed another pause before continuing, her tone conversational, even idle. "I often think," she said, "that those who hide things are sometimes careful about what they reveal and sometimes careless about what they leave behind. Even a misplaced object, or a brief hesitation, can tell more than words ever could." Whitby shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the mental pressure of her casual remarks forcing him to reassess, and in that moment he revealed something he did not intend, a flicker of guilt that passed across his otherwise controlled features. Miss Marple's eyes then fell on Harding, whose stoicism had seemed unassailable. She placed a small, innocuous item on the desk, a sealed envelope addressed to Edward Langley, which she had discovered, tucked behind other files in the green binder. Its presence was deliberate, though she made no comment. Harding's head turned sharply, his gaze fixing on the envelope for a heartbeat too long, and Miss Marple noticed the subtle widening of his eyes and a micro-tension in his jaw. He was aware, acutely, of the implication that the envelope contained something significant, something perhaps he wished to keep hidden. By observing these reactions, Miss Marple was able to piece together the unspoken dynamics at play. Whitby's unease suggested an opportunistic guilt, a man anxious about what could be discovered. Mrs. Langley's controlled tension indicated foreknowledge, a careful balance between concealment and disclosure. Harding's subtle physical betrayals hinted at knowledge he had previously shielded, a professional detachment undermined by personal involvement. Together, these clues, gathered not through confrontation but through the orchestration of ordinary events and psychological pressure, revealed the first tangible fractures in their careful defences. Miss Marple allowed the moment to settle, watching silently as each suspect grappled with their own awareness of what had been implied. The ordinary scene of a quiet morning in the study now shimmered with meaning, every glance, pause, and gesture carrying significance. The unconventional clue, she realized, was not a physical object but the responses themselves, the involuntary truths expressed through human behavior when prompted by subtle, deliberate suggestion. The cracks in their facades, once nearly invisible, were now beginning to form a pattern, guiding her closer to the heart of the deception that had claimed Edward Langley's life. And as she observed, she knew that patience would turn these subtle revelations into the threads from which the final truth could be unravelled. The morning air was brisk as Miss Marple returned to the Langley house, notebook in hand, ready to examine the developments she had observed the previous day. The study, usually so meticulously maintained, now carried a tension almost tangible in the quiet. Whitby was absent, claiming a business engagement, while Mrs. Langley and Harding were already there, ostensibly occupied with the final arrangements for the estate. Miss Marple had intended to review the green binder more closely, to trace the patterns in the ledgers against the reactions she had witnessed, but as she approached the desk, her heart sank slightly. The binder was gone, not merely moved, but vanished without trace. The neat stack of papers, the envelope she had so carefully placed, the very sequence of documents she had been following were gone. In their place lay a faint smear of ink, as if someone had hastily attempted to erase a record or to mask what had been there. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the subtle smudges along the edges of the desk and the faint fingerprints on the polished surface, leading to a chilling conclusion. Someone had removed or destroyed a key piece of evidence in the brief hours since she had last visited. Mrs. Langley's expression remained composed, but Miss Marple detected a small, almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes. Harding, for his part, appeared startled, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted the papers before him. The act had been deliberate, and the intent was clear: to impede discovery, to obscure the truth before it could be fully revealed. Miss Marple's mind raced, recalling every subtle reaction she had observed. The flicker of guilt on Whitby's face, the poised but controlled tension of the widow, the minuscule betrayals of Harding's practiced detachment. Whoever had removed the binder had knowledge of the house, the routines, and the importance of the evidence. She glanced toward the fireplace, remembering the spot where the key had been found. It was still there, gleaming faintly in the sunlight filtering through the lace curtains. The key alone, however, was meaningless without the context the binder had provided. Whoever had orchestrated this theft understood the danger posed by leaving the documents intact. They had acted quickly, decisively, to maintain control over the narrative. The crime was no longer merely a puzzle. It had become a race against concealment, a contest to unearth the truth before it was permanently buried. Miss Marple's thoughts turned immediately to the potential culprits. Whitby's absence seemed convenient, too neatly timed to be casual. Mrs. Langley's calm composure was familiar now in its subtle manipulation. She had always controlled appearances with care, and the sudden disappearance of the binder could very well have passed through her hands unnoticed by others. And Harding, whose professional knowledge of the estate and its documents had been indispensable, had both motive and opportunity to interfere if he feared exposure. The removal of the evidence was a calculated act, aimed at exploiting the gaps in attention, the unguarded moments of routine. The inspector arrived shortly after, summoned by the housekeeper, and surveyed the scene with a mixture of irritation and confusion. "It's as if it was never here," he muttered, lifting the smudged papers and running a finger over the desk. Miss Marple, standing quietly nearby, shook her head gently. "It was here," she said, her voice calm but precise, "and now it is gone. Someone knew its importance, and someone moved quickly to prevent it from being examined. That is the act of a mind calculating its risk, not of someone panicked or careless." She observed the expressions of those present. Whitby's absence, she noted, allowed for fewer eyes on the removal. Mrs. Langley's composed demeanour concealed a mind weighing each word, each reaction, while Harding's hands, slight tremors betraying him, suggested intimate familiarity with the contents now missing. Trust, she realized, had become a fragile and dangerous thing. Any assumption of cooperation might be exploited. The case, which had been gaining clarity through subtle psychological insight, had now been thrown into uncertainty. The threads she had been following, the reactions, the behaviors, the hidden motives, were all still present, but the tangible link between observation and evidence had been severed. Miss Marple, however, did not despair. She moved to the window, studying the garden and the path leading to the front gate, quietly plotting the possibilities. Whoever had taken the binder would need to hide it, destroy it, or use it to their advantage, and in doing so, they had revealed more than they realized. The act itself was a confession of calculation and anxiety. The case was no longer merely about uncovering discrepancies in accounts or subtle reactions. It was now about anticipating the next move of someone who believed they controlled the narrative. And Miss Marple, patient and observant, understood that the theft, rather than ending the investigation, had only sharpened the path to the truth, illuminating the hidden urgency behind a crime that reached far beyond a single act of misdirection. The following evening, as dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple returned to her lodgings after another day of quiet observation, her mind still tracing the threads of the missing binder and the subtle behavioral cues she had catalogued. The house had grown unusually silent, the villagers seemingly unaware of the heightened tension lingering just beneath the surface of their ordinary routines. Miss Marple's intuition, honed by years of observing human nature, warned her that the theft of the binder had not been the end of the story. It was merely a prelude to something more dangerous. Her instincts proved correct before she had even reached the door. A hurried knock startled her, and she opened it to find Harding standing in the hallway, his face pale, eyes wide with alarm. "Miss Marple, you must come quickly," he exclaimed, his usual composure shattered. Without waiting for explanation, he led her across the village to a narrow lane behind the Langley estate. There, in the faint light of the lanterns, she saw the scene that made her heart sink. Charles Whitby collapsed near the gate unconscious, a faint smear of blood on his temple. A struggle had clearly taken place, though there were no signs of forced entry or witnesses. Miss Marple knelt beside him, checking for responsiveness. Whitby stirred weakly, murmuring incoherently, but was otherwise alive. The significance, however, was undeniable. Someone had acted decisively to prevent further investigation, to silence or intimidate the one person now under scrutiny. The carefully orchestrated theft of the binder was no longer merely a cover, it had been part of a larger scheme. The villain was still at large, moving several steps ahead, and now the stakes had risen beyond mere deception to the potential for violence. Harding explained in a hushed voice that he had discovered Whitby's condition while returning from an errand, finding him slumped against the gate with no sign of assailant nearby. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she examined the area, noting the disturbed earth along the path, the scuff marks suggesting a hurried departure, and a small piece of torn paper partially buried beneath a flower bed. It appeared innocuous, but to her trained eye, even this fragment could carry meaning. A signature, a clue left behind in haste, or a taunt designed to unsettle anyone who might pursue the investigation. Her thoughts raced as she considered the implications. The assailant knew the investigation was moving too close to the truth and had taken measures to delay discovery. Whitby had been targeted not merely because of financial records or perceived motive, but because his knowledge made him a threat. The crime had escalated, from theft and manipulation to a direct physical warning, proving that the perpetrator was calculating and ruthless, yet still hiding behind the veil of ordinary appearances. Miss Marple's mind returned to Mrs. Langley. The widow's calm composure and subtle manipulations had always seemed controlled, yet in light of the attack, she could no longer be ruled out or ruled in. Harding, too, presented a duality, his outward professionalism now shadowed by the possibility of concealed intent or complicity. And Whitby, the previously accused, now clearly a potential victim, could not be trusted to provide a reliable account without the right circumstances. The investigation, once linear in its progression, had fractured into a network of uncertainty, with danger now an active, present force. Miss Marple, ever composed, recognized the necessity of immediate action tempered by strategic patience. She advised Harding to call the local constable discreetly while she surveyed the surrounding area for overlooked details. The faint prints along the lane, the disturbed soil, and even the torn scrap of paper, all were elements to be scrutinized carefully. Every small detail could now represent a critical piece of the puzzle, a thread leading toward the identity of the assailant who had boldly crossed the line from obstruction to physical threat. As they returned to the house, Miss Marple's mind pieced together the emergent pattern, the binder's disappearance, the subtle reactions of Whitby, Mrs. Langley, and Harding, and now the violent attempt to impede progress. The investigation had shifted dramatically. It was no longer simply about uncovering hidden motives or interpreting subtle cues. The perpetrator was active, aware, and dangerous, and the next move could be as devastating as the last. Miss Marple's resolve tightened. The case had taken a sharp, perilous turn, and she knew that only through patience, acute observation, and strategic insight could the next act, perhaps even a final revelation, be anticipated and, ultimately, prevented. In the uneasy calm that followed Whitby's attack, Miss Marple found herself surrounded by confusion rather than clarity. The constable had taken Whitby to the infirmary. Harding hovered between anxious concern and professional obligation, and Mrs. Langley remained in the house, pale but composed, insisting she knew nothing of the incident. The village whispered again, this time with sharper edges, fear creeping into conversations once satisfied with easy conclusions. Yet for Miss Marple, it was precisely this chaos that allowed order to surface. Disorder, she had always believed, revealed patterns to those patient enough to look. She returned to the Langley study alone, asking only that it be left undisturbed for an hour. The missing binder, the vanished envelope, and the violent escalation all pressed on her thoughts, but she forced herself to slow down, to look not for what had changed, but for what had remained constant throughout. She sat in Edward Langley's chair, folding her hands, letting the room speak in its quiet way. The desk, the shelves, the window, the fireplace, she had examined them all before. What she needed now was not another search, but recognition. Her eyes drifted once more to the window. It was still slightly ajar, just as it had been when Langley's body was found. That detail had been mentioned repeatedly, debated endlessly, and ultimately dismissed as insignificant. Yet Miss Marple recalled something Whitby had said during questioning, spoken almost carelessly, that Edward disliked draughts and always ensured windows were tightly shut before evening. Mrs. Langley had echoed something similar, though less firmly, while Harding had claimed not to notice such domestic habits at all. At the time, it had seemed trivial. Now it began to glow with quiet insistence. Miss Marple rose and examined the window latch closely. There were faint scratches there too, older than the recent disturbance in the room, suggesting it had been forced open, not violently, but deliberately, by someone familiar with its mechanism, not an intruder climbing in, but someone inside, opening it just enough to suggest access from without. It was a staged detail, meant to support a false narrative, and suddenly the phrase from the note, "Look beyond the numbers," shifted its meaning. It was not only about accounts or ledgers, it was about habits, patterns, the uncounted details of daily life that revealed truth more reliably than figures on a page. Her thoughts leapt back to the brass key, still lying innocently near the fireplace. Everyone had assumed it belonged to a cabinet or drawer connected to financial records. But Edward Langley's housekeeper, when asked in passing, had once mentioned that the small cupboard beneath the stairs was rarely opened and always kept locked. Miss Marple had dismissed it then as a domestic quirk. Now she went to the hallway and tried the key in the cupboard lock. It fit perfectly. Inside there were no documents, no money, no dramatic revelation, only a pair of muddy shoes carefully cleaned but not quite enough to remove the traces embedded in the seams. Miss Marple examined them closely. They were not Edward's. His shoes were always polished and stored upstairs. These were smaller, lighter, and unmistakably feminine. In that moment, several threads tightened into one clear line: Mrs. Langley's composure, her precise control of the household narrative, her familiarity with Edward's routines, the open window, the staged evidence, the careful redirection toward Whitby's accounts. Even the removal of the binder now made sense. Not as an act of desperation, out of confidence, once the real danger seemed diverted. Whitby's attack too fit the pattern, not an attempt to kill but to frighten, to keep him from speaking once he began to realize he had been used. Miss Marple returned to the study, her mind calm now, almost serene. The key had been in plain sight. So had the window. So had Mrs. Langley herself, moving quietly through the house, shaping events with the same careful attention Edward had once given to his numbers. The crime was not rooted in sudden passion or crude greed, but in long-held fear of exposure, of a past carefully buried being brought into the light. Edward had discovered the truth, not in the ledgers but beyond them, and had signalled it in the only way he could. As footsteps sounded in the corridor, Miss Marple closed the cupboard gently and returned the key to its place. The pattern had emerged at last, simple and inevitable. Everything had been there from the beginning, waiting patiently to be seen. Miss Marple did not confront Mrs. Langley at once. She had learned that truths of this kind, once spoken too early, tended to scatter rather than settle. Instead, she waited, observing the widow through the remainder of the afternoon, noting how she moved through the house with quiet authority, how the servants deferred to her without question, how every object seemed to remain exactly where she expected it to be. This was not merely familiarity, it was ownership of narrative, of memory itself. Mrs. Langley did not simply live in the house, she curated it. It was only when evening fell and the house grew still that Miss Marple asked to speak with her privately. They sat together in the small drawing-room, the fire casting soft shadows across Mrs. Langley's composed face. At first their conversation was polite, even mundane. Miss Marple spoke of village life, of Edward's habits, of how comforting our teens could be. Mrs. Langley listened attentively, her expression calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Yet Miss Marple noticed how her fingers tightened slightly when Edward's name was mentioned, how her breath shortened almost imperceptibly. Edward was a man who believed in order, Miss Marple said gently. Numbers, routines, records. He trusted them because they felt safe. Predictable. She paused, letting the silence do its work. But even the most orderly lives sometimes conceal things that cannot be measured. Mrs. Langley's gaze flickered, just for a moment. Miss Marple continued, her tone still mild. He discovered something recently, didn't he? Not in the accounts themselves, but beyond them. Something about the past. The widow smiled faintly. Everyone has a past, Miss Marple. That hardly makes one a murderer. No, Miss Marple agreed, but fear does. Particularly the kind that has been carried for years, carefully hidden, shaping every decision. Edward didn't uncover financial misconduct. He uncovered identity. The word landed between them like a dropped glass. Mrs. Langley's smile did not fade, but it stiffened. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "You were not born a Langley," she said softly, "nor who you claim to be. Years ago there was a scandal. Quietly resolved, records altered, names changed. Edward helped you then. He believed in protecting appearances, in preserving respectability. But lately he realized the truth could no longer remain buried. Mrs. Langley's composure cracked at last, not dramatically, but in a slow, devastating way. Her shoulders sagged as though relieved of a weight too heavy to carry any longer. "He was going to expose me," she said quietly, "not out of cruelty, out of conscience. He said lies, once lived too long, became a kind of poison." Miss Marple nodded. "And to you exposure meant annihilation, not loss. Of money or position, but of self. Everything you built depended on that secret remaining hidden." Tears welled in Mrs. Langley's eyes, though her voice remained steady. "You don't understand," she said. "I was nobody, less than nobody. I remade myself piece by piece. I learned how to speak, how to behave, how to disappear into respectability. Edward knew what I had been. He promised to protect me. Then he changed his mind." Miss Marple's expression was not judgmental, only sorrowful. "And when he left you that note, he wasn't taunting you. He was warning you. He believed someone would understand what he meant." Mrs. Langley nodded slowly. "I thought if I controlled the story I could survive. I staged the window, I moved the evidence. I let suspicion fall where it would. Whitby was useful, ambitious, careless. When he began to realize he'd been manipulated, I panicked. I didn't mean to kill him, only to frighten him." "And Edward?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mrs. Langley closed her eyes. "He confronted me. I begged him to reconsider. When he refused, I did what I had always done. I protected the life I built." The room fell silent, heavy with the weight of confession. Miss Marple understood now why the crime had felt so carefully constructed, so emotionally restrained. This was not a crime of passion, but of preservation. A woman defending the fragile architecture of her identity with ruthless precision. Shame, fear, and the terror of being unmade had driven her further than greed ever could. As footsteps sounded in the hall, Chief Inspector Simmons returning, Miss Marple rose slowly. The truth had surfaced at last, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet inevitability. The motive was not money nor revenge, but the desperate need to remain someone she had fought her entire life to become. And that, Miss Marple reflected sadly, was often the most dangerous motive of all. Miss Marple did not raise her voice when Chief Inspector Simmons entered the drawing-room, nor did she gesture dramatically toward Mrs. Langley. She merely stepped aside, allowing the inspector to take in the scene for himself, the widow seated very still, her composure fraying now that the truth had been spoken aloud, the quiet gravity that filled the room like thickened air. Miss Marple understood that confrontation, when done properly, did not require force. It required inevitability. "I believe," she said gently, "that it would be best if we all sat down." Mrs. Langley did not protest. That alone told Simmons more than any accusation might have. Miss Marple waited until the inspector had settled before speaking again, her tone calm, almost conversational. Edward Langley believed in preparation. He anticipated reactions, consequences. When he realized his life was in danger, he prepared one final safeguard, not in writing, but in habit. She turned toward the fireplace and lifted the brass key from the mantel. This key was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be found, and more importantly, noticed. Simmons frowned. "The cupboard under the stairs?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "But what mattered was not what was inside, but who knew it was there." Mrs. Langley cleaned the house herself whenever she was anxious. She could not bear servants discovering things that might disturb her sense of order. Edward noticed this habit years ago. When he grew afraid, he relied on it. Mrs. Langley's lips parted slightly. Her breathing quickened. Miss Marple continued unhurried. "You removed the binder because you believed it was the greatest danger, but you overlooked something simpler, the window. Edward hated drafts. He never left it open. That detail contradicted every story told after his death. It pointed not to an intruder, but to someone staging one." Mrs. Langley rose suddenly. "You have no proof," she said sharply, "only conjecture and psychology." Miss Marple met her gaze steadily. "On the contrary, you visited Whitby the night he was attacked. You told the constable you were resting, yet the mud on the shoes in the cupboard matched the lane behind the estate exactly. You cleaned them, but not well enough. Edward once told me something quite revealing, that you cleaned when you were frightened." The room felt as though it had drawn in on itself. Mrs. Langley's eyes darted toward the door, calculating distance, opportunity. Miss Marple noticed the shift immediately. "You won't escape," she said softly, not unkindly. "And you won't harm anyone else. Edward's mistake was believing you could bear the truth. I won't make the same one." For a heartbeat, it seemed Mrs. Langley might attempt something reckless. Her hand tightened around the arm of the chair, her jaw set, her entire being poised on the edge of a final, desperate choice. Simmons shifted subtly, ready to intervene. Then, slowly, the tension drained from her posture. She sank back into the chair, the fight leaving her all at once. "I only wanted to exist," she whispered, "not to be erased." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her resolve did not waver. "We all wish that," she said. "But existence built on fear cannot endure. It demands too many sacrifices." The inspector stepped forward, his voice firm but respectful. "Mrs. Langley, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Edward Langley and the assault on Charles Whitby." She did not resist. As Simmons led her toward the door, she paused and looked back at Miss Marple, a strange mixture of resentment and relief in her eyes. "You were watching all along?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied quietly. "People reveal themselves when they believe no one is truly paying attention." When the door closed behind them, the house seemed to exhale. Miss Marple remained where she was for a moment, listening to the fading footsteps, feeling the stillness return. The trap had not been sprung with clever tricks or dramatic revelations, but with patience and understanding, by allowing the truth to corner itself. She glanced once more at the study, at the window now firmly shut, and thought of Edward Langley's final, careful attempt to be understood. At last the pieces had settled into place, and as always, it was not brilliance that solved the mystery, but the quiet certainty that human nature, left undisturbed, would eventually tell its own story. For a brief while after Mrs. Langley was taken away, the village breathed easier. The whispers softened, the shutters reopened, and Chief Inspector Simmons allowed himself the relief of a case seemingly brought to a clean and satisfying close. Miss Marple, however, did not share that sense of completion. She remained at the Langley house long after the others had left, sitting quietly in the study, her knitting untouched in her lap, listening not to the silence but to what lay beneath it. There was a faint discord still, a note that refused to resolve. It came to her not as a sudden flash of brilliance, but as a gentle, persistent discomfort. Mrs. Langley's motive had been genuine, her fear real, her actions carefully reasoned. Yet something about the sequence of events still troubled Miss Marple. The widow had been clever, yes, but clever in a way born of caution and self-preservation. The precision of the false trail, the timing of the binder's disappearance, the orchestration of Whitby's convenient implication and subsequent attack, all of it suggested not merely desperation, but foresight, strategic foresight. Miss Marple's thoughts returned inevitably to Harding. He had been present at every critical juncture. He had known the house intimately, the documents thoroughly, the vulnerabilities of each person involved. He had been the one to discover Whitby after the attack. And most telling of all, he had never once seemed surprised, only concerned in a measured professional way, as though events were unfolding largely as he had anticipated. The inspector returned later that evening to collect final statements. Miss Marple asked, almost casually, whether the missing binder had been recovered. Simmons shook his head. "Mrs. Langley claims she destroyed it," he said. "Burned the papers in the kitchen grate the night she realized suspicion was shifting." "Did you find ash residue consistent with that?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Simmons hesitated, not conclusively, but her confession was sincere, Miss Marple agreed. "That does not make it complete." She asked to see Harding once more, and Simmons, though puzzled, agreed. Harding arrived looking tired but composed, grateful, he said, that the affair was finally at an end. Miss Marple offered him tea, and spoke for several minutes about entirely unrelated matters, estate law, village charities, the burden of responsibility that came with guardianship of other people's affairs. Harding relaxed, assuming this was merely polite conversation. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "Edward trusted you implicitly." Harding smiled faintly. "I like to think I earned that trust." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "That is what makes betrayal so effective." The smile faded. She did not accuse him. She merely continued, her voice calm, almost kind. "Mrs. Langley feared exposure, But fear alone does not design such elegant misdirection. You did. You understood how suspicion would fall, how the police would think. You guided Whitby into financial entanglements years ago, didn't you? Gave him just enough rope? Harding's eyes hardened. You have no proof. No, Miss Marple agreed. Boo. T. Edward did. That was why he left the note. Not for the police, for me. He knew I would look beyond the numbers and beyond the obvious culprit. She leaned forward slightly. You convinced Mrs. Langley that exposure was inevitable, that drastic action was her only option. You let her believe she was acting alone. When Edward died, you shaped the narrative. When Whitby became inconvenient, you frightened him into silence. And when Mrs. Langley confessed, you were content to let her bear the full weight. For the first time, Harding's composure truly cracked. I protected the estate, he said sharply. I protected stability. Edward was going to unravel everything. Identities, inheritances, legal chaos. People would have been ruined. And so you let a frightened woman become a murderer, Miss Marple said softly, and very nearly let an innocent man die. The room was utterly still. At last Harding straightened his coat, a bitter smile crossing his face. You're very perceptive for an old lady. Miss Marple returned the smile, gentle and unoffended. I've had practice. When Simmons was summoned back, the final pieces fell into place quickly. Faced with the quiet accumulation of facts and Miss Marple's unwavering calm, Harding said nothing more. His silence was confirmation enough. As the house emptied once again, Miss Marple stood by the window, watching the last light fade from the garden. The case had not been simple after all. It rarely was. Evil, she reflected, often hid behind reason, behind good intentions and orderly minds. Mrs. Langley had acted out of fear, but Harding had acted out of control, and that, she knew, was far more dangerous. Only when everything had been revealed did Miss Marple allow herself to rest. The truth had not merely been uncovered, it had been rescued from the very people who believed they had the right to decide which truths deserved to live. The night settled gently over the Langley estate, the kind of quiet that followed a storm rather than preceded one. Lamps glowed in a handful of windows as Chief Inspector Simmons concluded his work. Papers signed, statements recorded, the machinery of justice turning at last with deliberate certainty. Harding was taken into custody without spectacle. He did not protest, did not argue. His calm, even now, seemed almost an extension of his guilt. Control maintained until the very end. Miss Marple watched from the sitting room as the car disappeared down the drive. Only then did she allow herself to sit fully, her hands resting in her lap, her thoughts aligning at last into something resembling peace. Yet even peace, she knew, was rarely uncomplicated. Simmons returned inside, removing his hat. You were right, he said quietly, about all of it. The binder wasn't destroyed. Harding had it copied months ago, evidence enough to ruin lives, used like insurance. Mrs. Langley believed she was preventing disaster. Harding was ensuring leverage. Miss Marple nodded. People often confuse protection with possession, she said. Edward understood the difference. That is why he became dangerous to them. The inspector hesitated. Mrs. Langley, the court will consider her confession and Harding's influence, but she did strike the blow. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. She did. Fear pushed her hand, but the choice was still hers. That is the hardest truth of all. Simmons looked at her thoughtfully. And Whitby will recover, Miss Marple replied, and perhaps in time forgive himself for being so easily guided by promises of rescue. He was never greedy, only tired of being afraid. The inspector exhaled, a weight lifting. I don't think we would have uncovered half of this without you. Miss Marple smiled faintly. You would have, she said. Eventually. But you were listening for facts. I was listening for people. Before he left, Simmons asked her to explain, properly this time, how she had known. Miss Marple obliged, not with pride, but with clarity. She spoke of habits first, Edward's insistence on order, Mrs. Langley's compulsive cleaning, Harding's quiet habit of standing just close enough to conversations to hear without appearing to listen. She spoke of the window, left open not for escape but for illusion, of the binder, meant to be tempting, of the funeral itself, where Harding had watched not the coffin but the mourners, measuring reactions, anticipating consequences. The mistake, she concluded, was believing intelligence alone grants moral authority. Harding thought himself necessary, Indispensable men are often the most dangerous. When the inspector finally departed, the house grew still once more. Miss Marple rose and walked slowly through the rooms, pausing in the study where Edward Langley had once sat, worried and determined in equal measure. His plan had not been flawless. It had relied on faith, faith that someone would care enough to look closely, to listen carefully, to refuse the easy answer. That faith, she reflected, had not been misplaced. Justice, as it turned out, had been served. Harding would face trial, Mrs. Langley would face judgment, mitigated but not erased. The truth had emerged whole at last, no longer bent to serve another's design. And yet, Miss Marple knew, there would be those who felt unsettled rather than satisfied. Lives had been undone, comforting illusions stripped away. Some would wish the final revelation had remained buried. She stood by the window, looking out at the garden now dark and still, and allowed herself a small sigh. Mysteries were never truly about crime, she had long ago decided. They were about choices, made quietly, justified carefully, and lived with forever. As she turned away from the glass, the faintest echo of Edward Langley's intention seemed to linger in the room. Not vengeance, but understanding. Not spectacle, but truth. Miss Marple switched off the lamp and prepared for bed, content not because everything had ended neatly, but because it had ended honestly, and in her experience that was the closest justice ever came to perfection. Miss Marple did not leave the Langley estate at once. Morning came softly, pale light filtering through lace curtains, touching the furniture as though nothing dreadful had ever occurred within those walls. The police had gone. The house was no longer a crime scene, and yet she lingered, packing her small case with deliberate care, as though time itself might reveal something if she moved slowly enough. It was while she was fastening her gloves that the unease returned, not sharp, not urgent, but insistent. The feeling had accompanied her all her life, that quiet internal nudge that suggested a truth had been understood without quite being completed. Justice had been done, yes. Motives untangled, guilt apportioned, deception laid bare, and yet... She walked back into the study, drawn by no obvious reason. The room had been tidied, the papers aligned, the window firmly closed. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the desk, to the place where Edward Langley had once sat, his anxieties carefully ordered into neat stacks. She had examined this room dozens of times, but familiarity sometimes concealed what novelty could not. Her eyes fell upon a small framed photograph near the desk blotter, Edward as a younger man, standing beside another figure whose face was partly obscured by glare on the glass. Miss Marple had seen it before and dismissed it as sentimental clutter. Now she lifted it, angling it toward the light. The second figure was clearer than she remembered. Not H. Harding, not Mrs. Langley. It was Whitby, younger certainly, but unmistakable. The two men stood close, their shoulders nearly touching, an intimacy that spoke not of mere acquaintance but of shared history. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Whitby had always been portrayed as peripheral, drawn into the affair by money and misfortune. Yet here was evidence of something older, something foundational. She replaced the photograph carefully, her thoughts already rearranging themselves. Whitby had been manipulated, yes, but manipulation required access, trust, a pre-existing bond. Had Harding truly been the sole architect? Or had he merely stepped into a role once occupied by someone else? Miss Marple did not accuse the absent heir. She merely considered. Whitby's convenient silence over certain years, his oddly specific knowledge of estate finances, his fear, not just of Harding, but of being known. People feared exposure for many reasons, she reflected. Not all of them criminal. The thought did not undo the case. It did not free the guilty or condemn the innocent. But it shifted the picture slightly, as though a painting long admired had revealed a hidden layer beneath its surface. Later, as she walked down the gravel drive, Miss Marple paused at the gate. The village lay ahead, peaceful and unsuspecting, already beginning to file the affair away as finished business. She smiled faintly. Mysteries, she knew, never truly ended. They simply reached a point where the truth was sufficient. For now, on the train, she removed her gloves and opened her handbag, intending to resume her knitting. Instead, her fingers brushed against a folded slip of paper she did not remember placing there. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat and deliberate. "Not all debts are paid in court," it read. "Some are settled in silence. There was no signature." Miss Marple read it twice. The N folded it again and returned it to her bag. She did not look startled. She did not look afraid. Her eyes instead were thoughtful, almost curious. Whether the note was a remnant of the Langley affair or a prelude to something yet unseen hardly mattered. What mattered was that someone, somewhere, believed their secret intact. The train lurched forward, carrying her away from the estate, from the answers already won. Miss Marple gazed out the window as the countryside slid past, her reflection faint in the glass. She allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Human nature, after all, was endlessly repetitive, and where there were people, there would always be another puzzle, waiting patiently for someone willing to notice the smallest thing that did not quite belong.